welcome back. We are going to be talking about Daniel chapter 6 tonight. And so if you've been with us for the past, I guess it's almost 2 or 3 months, I've been working my way through the book of Daniel every other week with Brother Tim, who's also been teaching on other subjects. And so tonight we're in Daniel chapter 6. And each chapter we've learned give us a key word. Chapter 1 we learned about poise. Chapter 2 we learned about prayer. Chapter 3 is perseverance. Chapter 4 with Nebuchadnezzar is about praise. Chapter 5, what we talked about last week with Belshazzar, is the idea of chapter 6 this evening. We're going to focus on peace. And that's the key word, peace in the midst of all the chaos. And again, I can't think of a good or a better lesson to talk about than what we're currently in, peace in the midst of chaos. I think we all need a little bit of peace, just like Jesus' disciples were upset because of the storm on the sea and Jesus was sleeping down below. He was at peace because he's in control of all things. And so I think there's a measure of peace we need to experience today because the same is true. Jesus is in control of all things. So let's go to Daniel chapter 6 tonight, and let's look at one more narrative here in Daniel chapter 6. We're going to read the first couple of verses, but let me just share a couple of things before we read the first couple of verses so you kind of know where we're headed. Last week the week before with chapter 5, a new kingdom has now come into the mix. Babylon now is off the stage, and now we're going to talk about Medo-Persia, or the Medo-Persian Empire. So a new throne, a new government, new policies, new personnel, all that kind of stuff is going to be important in this chapter. Now, what's interesting is that if you like to do comparisons with chapters in Scripture, I encourage you to do a comparison between Daniel chapter 3 and Daniel chapter 6. You'll find a lot of the same things happening. There's the same type of plot development, the same wording, the same repetition, the same phrases. The structures are so similar. The only difference seems to be the characters. One is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the other one is Daniel. There's so many similarities between those two chapters. So if you like to do those types of contrasting studies, I encourage you to read chapter 3 and read chapter 6 side by side, and you'll notice how many similarities rather there are between those two chapters. But let's get to Daniel chapter 6 because that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So let's look at these first couple of verses in Daniel chapter 6. Verse 1. It says, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm." So that sets up our stage right now. The new king is in office here. His name is Darius. And from what we talked about in chapter 5, I think Darius the Mede is the same fella as Cyrus the Great, same guy, just a different name. Don't have time for that kind of discussion. But Darius here sets up this new kingdom with the Medo-Persians, okay? He establishes some rulers, some lower level officials. In the text, they're called, that word there, as satraps. And these were local leaders, officials, governors, kind of all subordinate. So you had 120 different satraps over the whole realm of the Persian Empire, of which now Babylon is a part of that Persian Empire. Now, for another example in Scripture, you can go to the book of Esther. Esther chapter 1 talks about King Xerxes, and King Xerxes has 127 satraps over all of his realm. So the number's not abnormal, but it just goes to show you that he wants to develop a highly organized system. So you have 120 satraps or divisions. You have 3 governors. One of those governors is about to be prime minister, and then you have the king. So that's kind of how this thinking is here in chapter 6. The text notes that the king was thinking about making Daniel his second in command, or head over these other 3 governors. So the prime minister might be a better term. And why? Well, think about it. Here's a scenario, okay? Back at the end of chapter 5 in Daniel, the when the general who took the city of Babylon came in chapter 5, and he brought in all of his troops. This general overthrew the city. His name was a fellow by the name of Gubaru. It's not in our Bibles. That's part of history. But what happens is that 3 weeks later, this general who took over Babylon, he dies. So with the king's representative in Babylon passed away, and not knowing much about Babylonian leadership or maybe who's the guy to choose to take over, Darius, again, who's also named Cyrus here at the end of chapter 6, appoints 3 potential candidates on equal level until he's ready to make a final decision as to who of those 3 candidates should be the one who controls this area or this big, larger province of Babylon. So that's kind of what's going on behind the scenes and as to the reason why this is happening as you're setting up a new government. And of course, the reason why he sets up these 3 governors is so that nothing's going to fall through the cracks. No uprising in these territories because of new leadership. Make sure the taxes are paid. There's going to be new policies, new personnel, and you need people in leadership so that that does not happen. And Daniel was likely put to the front of the list of those 3 governors to be in charge because of what happened back in chapter 5. And back in chapter 5, we learned from that a few weeks ago how he had an excellent spirit. He was able to solve riddles. Chapter 5, verse 11 is what the queen explains about Daniel: light and understanding and wisdom, excellent spirit, knowledge, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, explaining enigmas. All these are likely summed up in this attitude of an excellent spirit. And so once the king hears all this about Daniel, no doubt he's likely thinking about putting him in charge because he would be the one who could lead it and lead it effectively. But now the conspirators come back into the picture. Just like in Daniel chapter 3, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were leaders, just like Daniel here, who is a leader, when they're not willing to bow down to the statue of Nebuchadnezzar, there are ones who are close by ready to accuse them of disloyalty, just like there were conspirators here ready to accuse Daniel of disloyalty. And so look at verses 4 and 5 of chapter 6. It says, so the governor and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could not find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. So the information that the king had planned to set Daniel as prime minister leaks out. It gets out somehow. And because the king wanted to elevate Daniel to this position of authority, naturally there's jealousy. The jealousy comes from these governors, these 2 governors who were the candidates for the other positions, and that's not abnormal. The text here before us, I'm reading from the New King James. It says, so the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel. It makes you think that all of the satraps, all 120, and these 2 governors were all against Daniel. But that might not be the best understanding of the text. It's unlikely that all 120 satraps were involved in the plan. Interestingly, the old Greek version of Daniel cites that only the 2 other governors or the 2 other candidates plotted to eliminate. And that makes more sense than a conspiracy involving 120 people whose status and positions would not be affected in any way. And then you have to think about the end of the book of chapter 6. If the whole group was involved in the conspiracy, then all the men and their families would be cast into the lion's den, which would mean more than 500 people into a den of maybe 5 or 6 lions. You couldn't fit that many people in there. So it's likely that it's just the governors and maybe some supporters, maybe a few satraps of those governors. So might be a small party of, I'd say, 5 to 10 people that are in power trying to find a way to get rid of Daniel. And like so many politicians of the past, present, and future, Daniel's character flaws, they were the things that were sought out as the means by which they might make him fall from governmental positions. And you know full well, all you have to do is turn on the TV and you'll see, especially this time of year, with all the political ads, they're always trying to point out the other person's flaws to make themselves look better. So this is not new. As Solomon would say, there is nothing new under the sun from that pessimistic book of Ecclesiastes. But needless to say, Daniel's faithfulness was such that they could not put a finger on any error or any bad word or any fault or any misstep or any disloyalty at all, or any failure in the execution of his office. They couldn't put any finger, no complaints were registered. He had a sterling record, we might say. And so he remained trustworthy and loyal. But then the text says the only way that they could find any problem with Daniel is in regards to his faith, or in regards to, it says, the law of his God, his faith, his religious obligations, his religious duties, the fact that he was a Christian, the fact that he was a believer in the one true God. That's the only thing that they found that was worth attacking. And I find that also so similar to what happens today. Look at verse 6. Look at the plan of these conspirators. Verse 6, so these governors and satraps, they gathered before the king and said to him, King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and satraps, the counselors and advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. So you have this group of conspirators that settle on a plan. The only way we can find to depose Daniel from his position of leadership is against his faith. That's the only way that we can find it. And so they craft this ordinance. And this ordinance is very persuasive to the king. It makes him sound good. It makes him think, oh, I've established this great government. All the officials, everybody likes me. That's always good. It's always good for your popularity numbers. As you hear it touted all the time with the different presidents of the past, different popularity levels. I'm sure that Darius here was glad that a lot of them wanted to make this law. It makes him sound a little popular. And you can see the exaggerated claim. They said, all the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and satraps, they're exaggerating. Everybody in the kingdom wants this law to be made, making the ordinance even more enticing for the king, because if all the officials want it, then who am I as the king to stand in their way? And they further explain the ordinance. It says, for a period of 30 days, no man is to pray to any god except the king, noting that the consequences for disobeying will be the lion's den. Now, because of the way the text is rendered in some translations, there's a couple of different ways to take the understanding of this law. The first is the traditional view that has been, for 30 days, the only deity to be worshiped is the king. Okay, so that's the first way to look at it. That traditional view is that for only 30 days, the only deity to be worshiped is the king. However, this view has some logical or some natural problems because, number one, there's no other parallel in history for comparison, and the tolerant rulers of the Persian Empire would have decreed a law like this. We don't have anything in the history books about this. This would also pose a great risk. Think about it, prohibiting prayer to all deities. Within a general polytheistic setting, this would be sheer madness because the Persians worshiped lots of other gods, and you had the freedom to worship whatever god you wanted to. I guess much like in America when we have this religious freedom to worship whomever and whatever we want to. And so to say that it's only one for a period of 30 days would be sheer madness. The second view, and to me this makes more sense, sees the ordinance not as deifying the king, but as designating him as the only legitimate representative of deity for 30 days. So it's more or less like the only priest that you could pray for a period of 30 days. He's the only one that could go before you to God, we might say. It seems unlikely that it was actually intended to outlaw the practice that Daniel was engaged in. And I think that the nature of the ploy of Daniel's enemies was that they were able to employ sufficiently wording that was ambiguous. I can never say that word right. A wording that was confusing, much like some of the bills that you might read if you were a member of the state or Congress, some of those long 1,000-page bills that are so wordy and ambiguous. There you go, I got the word now, ambiguous. But the wording was ambiguous so that Daniel would not even be thought of as a threat by Darius. Darius thought, oh, surely this law is not going to affect him. And so that makes a better understanding of what's happening here. And also the fact that this law is only for a period of 30 days. So the king is thinking probably, oh, what can this hurt? It's just 30 days. It's not very long, but obviously the plan was designed carefully. It was designed to build up the king's ego. Everybody likes it. Everybody wants to sign it, build up his new authority as the king. Everybody's following me. And then it gets the king to also sign it quickly. So the king can't go through the bill and read it and figure out, now, what do they really mean about this? So the design for this law to be put into effect by the conspirators was very, very, it was trickery. It was sly. It was slick at what they did. And they knew what was going to happen. They knew something about Daniel. You see, in the first couple of verses, in verses 1 through 9, we find this problem that comes to the surface. But then you get to verse 10 of chapter 6 of Daniel, and we find that they were counting on something. They were counting on the predictability of Daniel. They knew that there was no other way that they could pull him out of his governmental position except if they made a law concerning the worship to his God. And that's exactly what he did. You know, when the law was passed, Daniel didn't change his religious behaviors. Look at what it says in chapter 6, verse 10. It says, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he knew it was signed. He went home, and in his upper room with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days, not something new. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast in the den of lions? The king answered, yes, that's what I said. The thing is true according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. They said, yes. So now you have these conspirators who depend on the predictability of Daniel. Now, as Daniel's here, it says he goes up and he goes into prayer. And it says he prays 3 times a day like he had always done before. Now, if we were to skip ahead in the book of Daniel to Daniel chapter 9, verses 1 to 2, we would know that Daniel undertook a study of Jeremiah's prophecy. Because in Jeremiah's prophecy, God had said through the prophet Jeremiah that Israel would only be in exile for a period of 70 years. Well, that exile at this point in time was within a few years of happening. It was coming soon, coming quickly. And Daniel was concerned about the return of his people to their homeland. And he even prayed for their national sins and confessed their sins so that they could be restored to their homeland. And so this posture of kneeling with his windows open towards Jerusalem was a posture of confession, because the normal posture for a Jewish person is to stand and to pray. It wasn't to kneel. It wasn't to lay on the floor, prostrate on the ground. It was to stand and to pray. That was the normal posture of a Jewish person. So when he's on his knees 3 times toward Jerusalem, he's praying for the return back to Jerusalem. He's praying for the exile to end. And so Daniel's kneeling here was probably related to that special situation. Daniel knew there was no higher authority that he was subject to except God, and he could not obey the law of the land. But he also knew, and he was also well aware of the consequences. And he prays 3 times a day. Now, expectantly or in a predictable manner, the conspirators came to Daniel's house and found exactly what they had hoped for. They knew that he was going to be on his knees praying. They predicted it. It certainly shows Daniel's faithfulness and loyalty to God, but it's also convenient for his conspirators. You know, while Daniel's enemies rely on the Persian law to rid them of Daniel, Daniel relies on his God to rid him of all trouble. He didn't change anything. He kept worshiping his God like he had always done. And you know what? No matter how bad the world gets, we're commanded to just keep being loyal and faithful to God. We are commanded to keep loyal and faithful to God no matter what is going on around us. It's that constant, diligent discipline of being faithful to God, being faithful to reading his word. You know what? I encourage you as well, because with so much stuff out there in social media, so much misreporting, so much what we like to call fake news, and just things out there that aren't verified. Our minds are being fluttered with and being filled with things that are just not true. And I encourage you, if there's any time to be a student of reading your Bible more, it's this time in which we're living. Fill your mind with the things of God. Fill your mind with the right doctrine, so you'll be able to combat the wrong doctrine when you hear it. Anyway, the principle here is predictability. And some consider predictability a trait that's a negative thing. You're predictable. We know you're always going to do it this way. It can have negative consequences, but it has much more positive value than negative in this text. And these conspirators knew Daniel so well that they were willing to bet their lives. They were willing to bet their lives on the fact that if we make up this fake law, that we can catch Daniel in the act. Because you know what? If they got caught in the act of trying to make up a law that would purposely try to depose an official, they probably would have met with the lion's den a lot quicker. But they hid it in such a way. But they knew that Daniel was predictable. They knew, and when push comes to shove, Daniel would find his way to his knees every time. And by the way, that's a great witness. Knowing that the only way someone else can get underneath your skin at work is when they start talking about Christianity, when they start talking about God. I mean, that's a great witness. And think about this. They planned to depose Daniel based on his faith. That might not be a good thing. We might look at that and saying how evil that is. But then look at it and say, wow, what a witness. They knew that the only way they could make him fall was if it related to their God. They knew the only way they could make him bend was if it meant related to their God. That's pretty powerful. Now, verses 12 and 13 tell us that they go in and sign the decree, and the conspirators bring the indictment before the king, saying that Daniel, he has ignored the decree. He's refused it and continues to make petitions to God 3 times a day. However, notice they attempt to find ways in which to pull his name through the mud. Listen to how they talk about it. Look at verse 13. So they answered and said before the king that Daniel, who was one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decrees that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. So the first way they attempt to kind of lower Darius's expectation of what's going on, they drag Daniel's name through the mud. They say, he is one of the exiles of Judah. He is suspect. We think it's him because he is not a Persian. He's a Jewish person. He's someone different than us. He doesn't have loyalty to us. And again, don't you see so many similarities between what's going on in our world today and what's happening in this text? Secondly, they try to widen the split here between Darius and Daniel by claiming that Daniel does not pay any attention to you, Majesty. Look at what it says. He doesn't pay attention to any of your laws. Look what it says there in verse 13. That Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. And it's trying to create this big divide between Darius and Daniel, who, from what we find out in the text, were good friends. I don't know how well of friends, but they liked each other. They had a good friendship, much like Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel did. They had a good friendship. And so these conspirators are going to find anything they can to slowly pull away the trust of the king from this fellow Daniel, whom the king is thinking to set over the affairs of the province of Babylon here, ruling on behalf of Medo-Persia. Now, verse 15, upset and frustrated. Darius is frustrated, obviously. And look at what happens. And notice this carefully in verse number 14, And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with, notice the next word, with himself. Don't you find that interesting? He was greatly displeased with himself. He wasn't displeased with Daniel. He wasn't displeased with the conspirators. He was displeased with himself. And set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men approached the king and said to the king, "Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed." So Darius here, he's upset and frustrated as he really truly learns the purpose of the ordinance. And the purpose of the ordinance has been to deceive him. And so he's upset with himself. He's saying, I knew that law was too good to be true. I've been duped. I knew it was too good to be true. And he's upset with himself. And so he takes on the responsibility of trying to find a way to free Daniel. He spends the rest of the evening. And again, Darius is not upset because Daniel had been praying, but for the first time he realized the real purpose of the law. For the first time he realized that it was not to honor him, but to eliminate a rival of the jealous officials. Think about that. Think about that as the beginning of your kingdom. He thought the beginning of the kingdom of this new Medo-Persian Empire and selecting someone to rule over the province of Babylon for him over this broader kingdom. He thought everything's going well so far. The transition is pretty good. Well, not exactly, king. Not exactly. This speaks volumes to the reader about Daniel's favored relationship that he held with the king. For the fact that the king is trying to find a way to get Daniel out. He's trying to find a way to get Daniel free. In fact, the word order of verse 14 in the original Aramaic places Daniel first in the sentence. It's in a position of emphasis. And it literally says, "And as for Daniel, he set his mind to deliver him." So Daniel's the focus of this text. He's trying to find a way. Darius is not the focus. The king's not the focus. The focus is on Daniel because Darius is trying to find a way to help Daniel out of the situation. It says that he exhausted all of his resources up until the very last minute, and then the conspirators come in to remind the king that he had to follow through with the law. To remind the king, and I'm sure the king knew this, but the conspirators probably come to rub it in his face, more or less. They come to remind the king. Now remember, king, the law of the Medes and Persians is a law that you cannot change. Not even the king can change the law. You can't change the law at all. In fact, there's a similar situation to this in the book of Esther. If you've ever read through the book of Esther, when the king made a law, he couldn't change it. But in the case of Esther, the king made another law to help cancel out the other law, and that saved all the Jewish people from being killed on that one day by the hands of Haman. And so in this Medo-Persian Empire, one of the things that is very that's a big deal for these kings, especially as you trace the Persian history, is this law of the Medes and Persians. And once the king makes a law, nobody, not even the king, can break the law or annul the law. Nothing at all. And that was one of the things that they were known for, were famous for, we might say. In fact, another thing the Persians were famous for, just a little side note, is the postal system and actually taxes. So those two things you can trace way back to the Persian Empire. So if you don't like any of those, go back to the Persians and you can complain to them. But needless to say, that's free. I didn't plan on telling you that, but anyway. Verses 16 and 17. So this is what happens. So the king gave the command, verses 16, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, your God whom you serve continually your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. Then a stone was brought out and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signets of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. So some Bible versions, for example, like the one I read from the New King James, the New American Standard, and others, make the phrase out when the king talks to Daniel, when Daniel is thrown into the lion's den and the king says these words. It kind of makes the phrase out to be a prediction from the king that Daniel's God will deliver him. I mean, look what it says in the end of verse 16. If you're reading a King James, a New King James, or a NASB, this is what it says. Your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. And it's capitalized, he will deliver you. So it's almost as if these translations are telling us that this is true and it's going to happen. It's almost as if these translators looked a little bit forward into the text to figure out what was going on and then adjusted some of the wording later on. The originals here speak of Darius making a plea, a wish or a hope that will be delivered. And again, this is another case of some of the interpreters of Scripture, because interpreters aren't perfect. No translation of the Bible is perfect. But it's just another case of interpreters getting ahead of themselves rather than staying true to what the text says. This brings up the principle that we often overlook in Bible interpretation. When we're interpreting historical data or a narrative, it's important we stay faithful to what the text says rather than reading ahead. We face this a lot in the book of Acts and in other places, but it's called the danger of pre-understanding. And we know Daniel was delivered from the lions, and we know that happens because we have the whole story and we can read it. But when Darius spoke the words of hope to Daniel, he didn't know that Daniel was going to be delivered. He didn't. For all he knew, that he thought Daniel was going to be eaten by the lions. Otherwise, why the very next day does he run fast in the wee hours of the morning to find if Daniel has been rescued? If he knew that Daniel was rescued, why wouldn't he sleep in? We'll get to that in just a minute. But the idea here is that you have to be careful. The idea here is that when we're dealing with a past event, we can't skip ahead to find more information and then use it to change the earlier wording. You can, however, look back into the past and learn from it. And that's precisely what you do, what your New Testament writers did. They wrote with a pre-understanding of the Old Testament. So you have to be careful, okay? And there's always an understanding. And yes, we know that God delivered Daniel because we have the story before us, but you just have to be careful. The king here wishes, he's hoping, he's praying, I guess, to the gods that he would know that Daniel would be delivered from the lion's den. A stone is placed over the mouth of the den and sealed it so that no foul play, no one's going to tamper with it. And Darius returns to his palace and spends the night fasting for Daniel. Again, if Darius knew that Daniel was going to be delivered, then why does he spend the night fasting? Why does he spend the night praying? Why does he do all of that? He should get a good night's sleep if he knows that God's going to deliver Daniel. Again, he doesn't. So it's a wish, it's a hope. He's saying, I hope that Daniel, your God whom you serve, I hope he's going to be able to deliver you, because you'd be a really good official that I could use in my kingdom to help me, I think is what he's thinking. So, verse 19, look at what happens. Or verse 18, rather. Now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also his sleep went from him. Then the king, verse 19, arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? So Darius's response here to Daniel being cast into the lion's den is quite different than Nebuchadnezzar's uncompassionate treatment of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. At daybreak, the text says, the king rushes to the lion's den to find out what happened to Daniel. Is he alive? Is he still there? And the reason why the king rushed, there's a historical reason here. The reason why the king rushed to the den as soon as possible was because of the ancient Babylonian custom and Persian custom as well of pardoning the victim if he had been tortured but remained alive. So if Daniel had not been killed by the lions, but if he had remained tortured and was still alive, then they would pull him out and his sentence would be completed, or he would be pardoned. And so he would not have to suffer it. And so Darius here goes to the den early in the morning to see if Daniel is still alive. And probably not able to see in the wee hours of the morning, Darius calls out to Daniel, and Darius uses the epithet for his God. He says here in verse 20, and when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the, you see what it says, living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? And so Darius uses that epithet for God, living God. It's frequently used in the Old Testament to denote that Israel's God is the one true God. In comparison to all the other gods who are false and dead and can't do anything, is the true and living God who is alive and active and does things for his people. Now, does this suggest that maybe Darius was a true believer in the God of Israel? Maybe, maybe not. But clearly here, the emphasis on living God, on that phrase, the living God, clearly the king regarded Daniel's fate as a test of whether his God was really alive or just an unproven supposition, like all the deities that the non-Jews worshiped. If the Hebrew God really existed, he would preserve his faithful servant from death. And if anyone deserved well from his God, then friends, it was Daniel. He's the one that deserved well, and who would not stop worshiping even in the pains of death, who would not stop worshiping despite everything else that's going on. He refused to. And Daniel responds to the words of the king, telling him that God sent an angel to shut the mouths of the lion. And naturally, we have some expectation or some need to know the identity of the angel. Look at verse 21. Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the mouths of the lions so that they might not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him." Not before you, king, but before him. "And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you." Daniel's concerned first about his position with his own God, and then he's concerned about who his position in the earthly realm, you might say, the king here. And again, naturally, there's some speculation as to the identity of the angel. Some believe it was one of the angelic host. Others believe it was the angel of the Lord. Some talk about a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. If you read the Septuagint says that God closes the mouth of the lions, not the angel. Now, what's fascinating and what's interesting, this is the point of the text. And so this will show you that sometimes the identity is not important. Now watch this, okay? So the point of the text, if you look in the original Aramaic, the subject of the verb, that is, who is doing the shutting of the lion's mouth, is not indicated. It's not there. It's not there. So the point of the text is that it doesn't matter how God chose to shut the mouths of the lions. The simple fact that he did shut the mouths of the lions. And that's what Daniel testifies to. Daniel doesn't testify or make any allusions to his great courage or his outstanding faith or how he persevered in the midst of all this harm and how he suffered and how he just was awesome in his abilities. He makes no mention of any of that. And let that be a lesson for us today as well. When we get into hard situations and circumstances where we are persecuted in situations like this, it's not about us. It's about the God that we serve. Are we loyal to him? Because Daniel prefers to center his testimony on the living God who has shut the mouths of the lions. Look what he says. Read it with me again here. Verse 21, then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the mouths of the lions so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him," means before God, "and also, O king, I have done no wrong before you." That was before the king. Daniel is so concerned of making sure that God gets all the praise for the deliverance. He had nothing to do with it. It was all God. And sometimes I think when we go through trials, hard times, difficulties, unbearable circumstances, maybe we get a bad diagnosis and we go through those difficult times and we get through them and we're thankful. We need to stop and be more consistent, more predictable in stopping and praising God for it, or thanking God for coming and interceding on our behalf, because that's what happens. And so Daniel does that. He makes sure that God gets the glory, the very first thing out of his mouth, the very first thing. He answers the king and says, "King, yes, the mouths of the lions were shut, and my God was the one who did it." I mean, how much more blunt and straightforward can you get than that? And the language of deliverance in Daniel 6 and Daniel 3 is very, very similar. Notice that just as the three friends do not even have a smell of smoke on their clothes as they are brought out of the fiery inferno in Daniel chapter 3, so Daniel doesn't have a scratch on his body when he's lifted out of the den, even though he spent the night with the lions. And with this event, Daniel secured his place in the hall of faith, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 33, where it states, "Who through faith stopped the mouth of lions." Look at what verse 23 says. "Now the king was exceedingly glad for him and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he believed in his God." No injury was found because why? Because he believed in his God. Now, if injury was found, Daniel still could believe in his God, If God chose not to deliver Daniel, Daniel would have likely still followed through and still been faithful. If we know Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, if God doesn't deliver us, we're still going to follow him. So we have to be careful here, knowing that the God we serve, what's going to happen to us if we choose to serve God rather than man, we need to be well aware of the consequences. And Daniel was well aware of the consequences because remember it says when he saw the law was signed, he went and he did what he had always done. He knew the law was signed. He knew what he was doing was probably illegal, but he knew it was much more important for him to obey God than men. He knew the consequences. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they knew the consequences if they didn't bow down to the statue. They knew the consequences. And so that's part of understanding the deliverance here. They know. It's not as if they step back and say, oh, we didn't know about this. We're not guilty. No, they full well knew. They had no problems with this. Now, verse 24 says this. This is what happens to the conspirators. And the king gave the command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel. And they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives. The lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. Now, the conspirators who maliciously accused Daniel, and that word maliciously accused, or I think it's accused here. It's the same word that we find earlier in Daniel chapter 3, verse 8 about the Chaldeans who maliciously accused. And I find that word interesting because maliciously accused is an idiom that is rendered as who has eaten the pieces of, or literally eats the pieces of. And I find it interesting here. It's conspirators who they tried to eat the pieces of Daniel or tried to grind him up and spit him out as somebody who's not worthy, but yet they get eaten to pieces in this text. And so the penalty and punishment for Daniel's accusation was now transferred to his accusers. And that was something that was a common practice in the ancient Near East. And so the inclusion of the wives in the family, while that might not sound fair, it follows the ancient custom of corporate responsibility, where your family is responsible. You look at the book of Joshua, when Achan sinned, him and all of his family were killed as a result. So there's a corporate responsibility that was there as well. And so these two governors and maybe a handful of other satraps were thrown into the lion's den, their wives and their families. And the miraculous nature of Daniel's deliverance is kind of highlighted, is shown by how the lions pounce on the conspirators right away. When they're thrown into the lion's den. Lest someone get the mistaken impression that these lions were old, fat, or just not hungry, the author points out that when the wicked officials were thrown into the den, the lions pounced upon them before they even reached the bottom of the pit, overpowering them, crushing all of their bones. Again, this detail demonstrates the miraculous character of Daniel's deliverance. Now, one other thing. Do you realize that Daniel is very old at this time? This is not a young Daniel. Sometimes some of those pictures we see of artist rendition of Daniel in the lion's den, he looks like this young, strapping fella in the middle of the lions as if trying to fight them off, you might think. Or some people that maybe not know the text of Daniel 6 might think, well, he's a strong fella, he can survive through it. Daniel was very old. He's probably about 81 or 82 years old when he's thrown into the lion's den. So you can think about this. I mean, think about the peace that's residing in Daniel's heart. Daniel knows that God is in complete control. And he has nothing but peace. He's not going to change his behavior. He's not going to change the fact that he prays 3 times a day. It's so ingrained into who he is. The very core of who he is he wants to be one who is faithful and loyal and one who worships God. Now, that's something that was developed over a lifetime of Daniel's experience. And that wasn't developed over a lifetime because he was in a godly home. No. He was in Babylonian exile for 70 years. Maybe the first 12 or 13 years of his life, he was trained by his parents. But that training by his parents helped him, we might say, endure this 70 years. So in this 70 years, he's in a culture that's not conducive to allowing him the freedom to do the things, the freedoms that we would have to do. Yet he did it every single day. Every single day. That's what makes him stand out more than a lot of men of Scripture, because he's not in an environment where it's conducive to worship God and to worship him freely. We should be thankful today. We live in an environment where it's conducive to worship God and to worship him freely. I mean, In our part of the world that we live in, we have no problem going into a room in our house somewhere, opening our Bible and reading the scriptures, getting online and watching a video or a sermon, going to a church and hearing the word of God preached. There's freedom to do that. So we should have no reason, we should have no excuse of not being able to do that each and every day. And as we grow, we become stronger and stronger as Christians. Daniel, if there's anybody that had an excuse, it was him. Because he was living in an environment where you just didn't do that. And if you did those kinds of things, sometimes you were persecuted for your faith. And there are other countries in the world that are like that. But listen to what happens at the end, okay? Verse 25, this is what happens at the end of Daniel 6. It says, then King Darius wrote, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions, he says. And so just like the narrative in Daniel chapter 3, at the very end, the deliverance in Daniel chapter 6 here constitutes a royal edict or a royal decree, okay? The king's decree is made up of three parts. First, he says a greeting, may peace be to everyone, okay? Similar to Paul's greetings in his epistles, grace and peace, you know? Second, the command of the decree is to revere Daniel's God, to respect Daniel's God. It goes much further than the decree in Daniel chapter 3. It's a positive decree of respect. Third is the rationale for the decree, which in a nutshell allows the reader to understand the purpose of the miracle, the purpose of this miracle here. Miracles are not performed by God to show off his abilities. They are performed by God to demonstrate that he alone is the one true God. Daniel was not delivered for any benefit of his own, but for the purpose of showing a pagan king the reality and power of the one true God. Now, within all this context, we go back to that initial word that we began the lesson with, which is peace. Peace in the midst of all this chaos. How can he have so much peace in the midst of all this chaos? 81, 82 years old, all this peace. It just goes to show you that Daniel truly believed that God was in control of all things. He knew that nothing took God by surprise. He knew that everything was a part of his plan. He knew that there were no hiccups in God's plan. God does everything for a reason. It might look strange, it might sound mysterious, but he has a purpose in everything he does. And when you truly have faith and you believe in that, then you can sit back and, you know what, let God be God and be at peace. Because you know that as long as you're following Scripture and being faithful to him, that you can have that sense of peace. Because there's nothing you can do to control the affairs like that of the world, like God controls the affairs of the world. Yes, you can pray and ask God to do things on your behalf, and he does those. But when God has control and orchestrates all the events of the world, he's the one that does it. And so there's no reason why we need to get all up in arms. We just need to be at peace. And you look at Daniel, look at his great example here. And verse 28, it says, so this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Mede here. And that's why I think these two fellows are the same person, Darius and Cyrus. And so that brings to a close these first 6 chapters of Daniel. And these first 6 chapters of Daniel have been focused on what do we do when we're confronted with a problem? Well, in chapter 1, we learn that we use poise. In chapter 2, we learn that we use prayer. In chapter 3, sometimes it takes perseverance. In chapter 4, man, we need to learn to praise God. In chapter 5, sometimes we need to look at our perspective, because sometimes we want God to do something one way and it doesn't look like he's going to do it that way. He has control of things. Sometimes our perspective is skewed. And then what we just talked about, chapter 6 is peace. Sometimes we need to respond with peace. And so each of these 6 chapters teaches us how we are to trust God in the midst of all the dangers that we're confronted with. And in our society today, as we're confronted with all these dangers, we need to follow these 6 chapters because they provide these principles that which can help us as we grow in our faith. Now, the next time we meet, we're going to start discussing and going into a little bit of prophecy. And so the next time we meet, which will be 2 weeks from today, we're going to start talking about Daniel chapter 2, the second half of Daniel chapter 2, and Daniel chapter 7, and the similarities between the prophecy. And so while chapters 1 through 6 teach us to trust God despite the dangers, chapters 7 through 12 teach us to trust God despite the details. Because you know as well as I do that in prophecy there are a lot of details. And sometimes we can get lost in all the details instead of seeing the bigger picture. And so that's where we're headed. Thank you for joining me for this week. I hope to see you in a few weeks from now.